Imagine a world where the balance of trade and power is shifting faster than ever before. For decades, the global economy has been dominated by one narrative. The West writes the rules, and others follow them. But at the latest BRICS summit, something dramatic unfolded. Brazil's President Lula stood before leaders and declared that developing nations will no longer accept what he called tariff blackmail. His words weren't just rhetoric. They carried the weight of frustration that has been building in countries across the global South. Frustration with trade rules that are increasingly seen as political weapons rather than economic tools. When Lula spoke, he wasn't just addressing Brazil's problems, he was speaking for an entire coalition. He reminded the world that trade should be about fairness and growth, not punishment and coercion. Behind him stood India, China, Russia, South Africa, and a growing list of countries eager to join the BRICS alliance. Together, they are demanding a global trade system where tariffs are not used to manipulate weaker economies or enforce political agendas. And this, more than anything else, is why his words are reverberating across the globe. India, too, made it clear. Linking non-trade issues with trade practices is unacceptable. This is a direct response to policies often used by Western powers: sanctions, tariffs, and restrictions imposed under the banner of values or security, but ultimately aimed at maintaining dominance. For countries like India and Brazil, this isn't just about economics, it's about sovereignty. Why should one nation dictate how another builds its economy, its energy sector, or even its technology partnerships? The BRICS summit became a platform not just for criticism, but for vision. Leaders spoke of expanding internal trade within BRICS nations, using local currencies instead of the US dollar, and creating a safety net for economies vulnerable to Western pressure. Imagine the potential if India and Brazil trade in rupees and reais, if China and South Africa use yuan and rand, if Russia sells oil without touching the dollar. The ripple effect would be enormous. For the first time in modern history, the world could see a serious alternative to the dollar-driven global trade system. But Lula's phrase, tariff blackmail, hit hardest. He pointed out how advanced economies often push for environmental or labor standards in trade agreements but then use those as excuses to impose tariffs or deny market access. For developing nations, this feels like a trap. On one hand, they're told to follow rules for the good of the planet or human rights. On the other hand, when they try to grow, they are punished with tariffs that make their exports uncompetitive. It's a lose-lose scenario designed, many argue, to keep them dependent. This is where the unity of BRICS becomes so powerful. If one country resists, it can be isolated. But if dozens of countries resist together, suddenly the equation changes. The BRICS alliance now represents nearly half of the world's population and a significant share of its GDP. Imagine that weight being used to negotiate trade deals on equal terms, without bending to the old order's pressure. Of course, the West is not silent. Officials in Washington and Brussels argue that tariffs and trade rules are about fairness, about ensuring a level playing field, about protecting their industries from unfair competition. But critics in the global South see it differently. They see double standards. They see Western nations subsidizing their own industries while accusing others of protectionism. They see sanctions used not as tools of justice, but as weapons of economic warfare. The summit also highlighted something deeper, a psychological shift. For years, developing countries complained quietly about unfair systems but still played along. Now they are openly challenging the system. They were not just asking for reforms within the WTO or IMF. They're rebuilding new institutions outside of them. The new development bank, alternative payment systems, and direct trade in local currencies are no longer ideas on paper. They're becoming reality. Picture the symbolic image. While Lula was speaking, leaders from across Asia, Africa, and Latin America nodded in agreement. They know that if they don't act now, their economies will forever be shaped by rules written in Washington or Brussels. They also know that unity is their greatest weapon. A tariff on one nation's steel may cripple it, but a tariff on BRICS steel? That becomes a global crisis. That leverage is what makes the bloc powerful. This new resistance is not just about money, it's about dignity. Leaders like Lula, Modi, and Xi Jinping are framing it as a struggle for respect. for recognition that the world is multipolar, not unipolar. When tariffs are used as weapons, they say, it's not just unfair, it's humiliating. And humiliation has always been a powerful motivator in geopolitics. Nations that feel disrespected will always seek ways to push back. As viewers, it's important to understand what this means for the future. If BRICS nations succeed in reducing their dependence on Western markets and the dollar, the very foundation of U.S. economic power could weaken. The ability to impose sanctions, to isolate, to punish through tariffs, all of this relies on the centrality of the dollar in Western markets. Break that dependence, and the world order itself begins to tilt. But make no mistake, this path is not easy. Trade within BRICS still faces challenges. Infrastructure, regulatory differences, political disagreements, all of these could slow progress. The West will also fight back, using every diplomatic and economic tool at its disposal. The question is whether BRICS countries have the patience, the trust, and the shared vision to withstand that pressure. Yet the mood at the summit shows they are determined. For leaders like Lula, this is not just about trade policy. It's about leaving behind a legacy, about reshaping history. His call against tariff blackmail may well be remembered as one of the moments when the tide began to turn, when the developing world collectively said, enough. As the camera shifts from one leader to another, you can sense the gravity. These are not empty speeches. These are declarations of intent. And every viewer watching today should ask, what happens when the world's largest economies outside the West decide to change the rules? Will the West adapt and negotiate a fairer system? Or will it cling to its old power, escalating the conflict into an even more dangerous trade war? The answers aren't clear yet, but one thing is certain. The system as we know it is under challenge. And when nearly half the planet stands behind that challenge, the consequences will not be small. Whether this leads to cooperation or confrontation, whether it ends in reform or rupture, the coming years will define the future of global trade and power. That is why Lula's warning matters. It is not just a headline. It is a signal of a new era, one where countries refuse to bow to economic intimidation, one where alternatives to the dollar and the old trade system are not dreams, but necessities. And if history has taught us anything, it's that once the tide of change begins, it rarely stops. The world is watching, and the BRICS nations are ready to push forward.